Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. Today is something special. I would like us to research Russian imperialism, to look at the roots, those useful idiots, and the historical reasons why this monster we as a world community have to deal with it. And is there hope for all of us, for Ukraine as a member, for the Europe, which other countries like Baltic countries or Poland and Finland have to put up with this? And and I have very special guest. So I have become familiar with this person long before he didn't know about my existence, because he's one of the most powerful and the most known media managers in Ukraine. Recently, I mean the past several years, he's been the author of many historical books. And also, he is having fun being a political consultant. So let's see what he's gonna tell us. And also, we're gonna discuss his latest book, Pawns of the Darkness. So my guest today, Oleksii Mustafin. Hello, how are you today?
Добрий день, чудово.
Oleksii, Hello, Oleksii. Why exactly? Why exactly? And not just the book we will be discussing today, but also you explore this Russian imperialism from many sides, from different aspects, the consequences, the causes, the people who over the centuries have played along with all of this. Why Russian imperialism specifically?
Well, the question is rhetorical, because it's something we face every day, at least here in Kiev, certainly. There are people who deal with it every minute, especially those closer to the front line. But again, this is part of our current life, and, I'm not afraid to say it, part of Europe's life too. Because it simply can't not affect the entire continent. That's why it's obviously the most relevant topic right now, for reflection, for research, for study, and so on. Of course, that doesn't mean it just appeared recently. In fact, the books I've published lately, the last two books in particular, are about a long historical process that has unfolded over centuries. From my point of view, that's crucial to understanding what's happening today, because the patterns, they repeat. And when I was presenting my latest book, I said it's a book about today's Trumps and the Trumps of the past. Trump may seem like a unique figure to himself, but for someone who studies history, he's just another example, not even the first, of political leaders who tried to use Russia for their own purposes and ended up being used by Russia instead. That's why the book is called Pawns of Darkness, Who Raised the Monster. That's the full title, because I believe the whole world had a hand in raising this monster. And we can't shift the blame, even from Ukrainians. Ukrainians contributed just as much as others. And what's notable is that Russians constantly take offense at those who brought them into the world, so to speak, those who helped them become what they are. For example, today there's this popular narrative blaming everything on the Anglo-Saxons, claiming they're constantly scheming against Russia. There was even that press conference with Lavrov, where he once again went on about these devious Anglo-Saxons. He said they even invented Peter the Great's testament, a fake, of course, to spread Russophobia.
Просто головна ідея цього документу, або не документу,
But for anyone who knows even a bit of history, that's a very odd claim.
захопити весь світ.
After hearing it, I went back and looked at the literature on this so-called Testament of Peter.
Дивна англосаксонська підступність полягає в тому, що пропагується союз з Британією.
It's generally considered more a piece of fiction than a real document. But here's the thing. The core idea of this fictional testament is that for Russia to conquer the world, it must ally with Great Britain.
Я не дуже заглиблювався в цю тему, і, ви знаєте, я знайшов реальний документ, який існує, який виданий, до речі, не в Британії чи Сполучених Штатах,
So if this is some Anglo-Saxon trick,
виданий в
it's a strange one, promoting an alliance with Britain.
діючого.
Then I started digging deeper into this testament story, and even I was surprised. I've studied history all my life. I have a degree in history and teach it. But I hadn't gone that far into this topic before. And you know what? I found a real document, not published in Britain or the US, not by Anglo-Saxons, but in Russia.
Бо в літературній історії є там розповідь, яким чином ці папери потрапили на Захід, і вони цілком вкладаються.
It was an official document from the Russian Empire's chancellor at the time, addressed to his deputy Gronsov, laying out Russia's foreign policy doctrine, and it basically matches what's written in that fictional testament, just in different words.
В науковій літературі російській це існує саме як система Петра Великого, тобто, знову-таки, навіть ім'я Петра використовується. Але знову-таки,
So this is a real document, officially released and stored in Russian archives, and it aligns surprisingly well with the literary version.
в 18 сторіччі, до перемоги над Наполеоном, була тією силою, яка заводила Росію в Європу. В 1817 році
In the story, there's an explanation of how the papers ended up in the West, and it all fits, because this letter outlines the same ideas. Even Russian academic literature refers to it as Peter the Great system, so again, even the name of Peter is used.
так, Україна зараз потерпає, але свого часу
And yet everyone still walks around saying, it's a forgery, it's a forgery. Turns out, it's not. From my point of view, in the 19th century, especially before Napoleon's defeat, Britain was the power that pulled Russia into Europe. In 1817, even Wilson, the British statesman, was horrified at what it had led to. But the fact remains, everyone helped Russia become what it is. And yet Ukraine gets hit the hardest. Ukraine is simply closer. But really, Ukraine wasn't the first. It's important to point this out. Yes, Ukraine is suffering now, but before that, other nations and peoples were absorbed by the Russian Empire, like Novgorod, which was practically wiped out, or the Tatars, who remain as a people but were deeply integrated into the imperial system. So the Ukrainians became the next victims, and again with help from other Ukrainians. Ukrainians invented many of the concepts that the Russians later adopted, like the idea of Little Russia and Great Russia. That didn't come from Moscow, it originated in Ukraine. The concept of the Russian Empire itself was created by a Ukrainian, so Ukrainians were part of this too. Then came the Austrians, other Slavs, the British, everyone, Germans too. If you look at it that way, it really does seem like the whole world took turns passing the baton of helping Russia emerge onto the global political stage. The players change, but Russia remains constant. Since which century now? Their expansion isn't exactly non-stop. They can be stopped from time to time. For instance, compare what Russia was in the early 19th century.
You mentioned the Napoleonic Wars. If I'm not mistaken, I remember from listening to your earlier conversation about propaganda with Mr. Petrov that this was the very period when you talked about how Russia needed to somehow justify its greatness, its supposed right to exist among the equal European nations. That's when the myth of the great Russian culture started to be deliberately and intensively constructed. At first, it wasn't immediately accepted. I remember that example you gave about the publications of Dostoevsky, that the first edition basically went straight into the trash. But then, 10 years later, once the ground had been prepared, it finally took hold and people actually began to read his books.
It's true. We often forget that the entire concept of a great Russian culture is actually quite an artificial product. It consists of two parts. First, Russia simply appropriated a lot of cultural achievements from other peoples, especially those incorporated into the Russian Empire. This includes, for example, Ukrainian artists, painters, composers, writers from the 18th and early 19th centuries. Some were co-opted willingly, like Gogol, and others were just absorbed posthumously, so to speak. Russia claimed them as its own and grew great in size simply by including the achievements of many cultures. Naturally, that makes it look more developed. Second, it was a targeted policy. There's actually a very interesting document from the early 19th century. A Russian diplomat named Fyodor Tyutchev. He was a bit, shall we say, loose with his affections. He had a wife and a mistress and couldn't really manage either of them. At one point, when he decided to get married again, he was serving as a consul in Turin, in the Kingdom of Sardinia. He urgently fled to Switzerland. He left so abruptly that he lost his diplomatic ciphers and, as you'd expect, was fired. But he wanted to return to service through one of his old flames, perhaps more than a flame, a woman to whom he even dedicated the poem, "I Met You." Those who know Russian literature will recognize it. Her name was Amélie von Kuenberg. Through her, he got in touch with the chief of gendarmes, Count Benkendorf, and proposed, and this still exists in two versions, the so-called Tyutchev Memorandum. In it, he laid out a plan for propaganda in Europe, political and cultural expansion. The Tsar approved it, gave him some money, and restored him to the civil service, which was his main goal. Tyutchev's friend, Ivan Turgenev, then took up the task of promoting this idea of great Russian literature. Turgenev knew languages, moved in elite circles, and began spreading Russian literature abroad. In the mid-19th century, not many Europeans read in Russian or Ukrainian. As the old joke goes, most of them knew about Russian literature from what Turgenev told them. They didn't read the originals. They learned about it from his retellings. And Turgenev did a great deal to promote it. There's even a rather amusing example. The famous French writer Jules Verne who wrote science-themed novels, had one of his manuscripts sent by his publisher to Turgenev for review to see if everything was correct. Just imagine the level of influence that a French writer's work was essentially sent to a Russian figure for review, or, if you will, censorship. Another fascinating story, when Werner was writing his famous novels, like The Mysterious Island and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he originally intended the character Captain Nemo to be a Pole who had escaped after the suppression of the Polish uprising. But because France needed to maintain friendly ties with Russia, Nemo was rewritten as an Indian fighting British imperialism. These were not abstract shifts. They were very tangible, very deliberate. When I studied this history, it became very clear why the myth of great Russian culture emerged in the late 19th century. European powers, on one side, newly unified Germany, and on the other, France, needed an alliance with Russia. For Germany, it was a bit simpler. Their regime was authoritarian, somewhat similar to Russia's. Bismarck, for example, was considered by Tsar Alexander I to be almost his personal agent. With France, though, it was more complicated. They were a republic with values like liberty, equality, fraternity, and suddenly they had to cozy up to a despotic regime that persecuted everyone. So they came up with this clever narrative. We're not allying with autocracy and bloodshed. We're allying with the Russian people, the creators of this grand literature. Perhaps even a suffering people, oppressed by the Tsar, a sentiment that sounds very familiar today. The modern narrative of the good Russians. It's not new. Back then, many supported Russian opposition figures because they were fighting against Tsarism. It all seemed very proper and respectable. But later, many of those same revolutionaries, or at least some of them, became Bolsheviks, and people were suddenly surprised. How did that happen? We were doing everything right. But clearly they weren't. Sometimes it's all terrifying, even sinister. Other times it's simply absurd, especially when you see how history repeats itself again and.
So, I will ask you about the chance later. But Luke, you mentioned that there have been these Trumps throughout the centuries. People who think they are using the monster, but in reality they are feeding it. And the monster grows and does what it does. Have you figured out for yourself what the main mistakes of these Trumps are? Those who think they are in control or deceive themselves into thinking so?
Перша помилка думати, що вони можуть використати Росію своїм, що вони розумніші за всіх. Розумієте? От попередники наші помилилися, тому що вони дурні були. А ми розумні, ми тут всіх зараз обведемо навколо пальця, використаємо і з нами це не повториться. Коли політик державний...
First of all, the first mistake is thinking that they can use Russia for their own purposes, that they are smarter than everyone else. You know, they believe our predecessors failed because they were fools, but we are clever. We'll outsmart everyone and use Russia. This time it'll be different. As soon as a politician, a statesman, or an entire country starts thinking like that, they are already caught in the trap. The second crucial mistake is perceiving Russians as just slightly different Europeans, maybe not entirely Western, but still Western people. You see, when Western intellectuals wrote about the Ottoman Empire or the Qing Empire, the Manchus and Chinese, they understood those were different civilizations with different approaches to politics, true Eastern despotisms. But Russia, thanks to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Peter more spontaneously, Catherine more systematically, managed to create an image of being a different kind of West. You know, we're like the West, and then, at the next stage, we're better than the West. They'd say, whatever you don't like about the West, we don't have that. We speak the same languages. French, for example. We wear the same clothes. At the time, waistcoats and wigs, later neckties. We look like Europeans. But eventually, the mask comes off, and the face underneath is clearly not European. And by then, it's too late. This is the trap that Western intellectuals have fallen into again and again. It started, I think, with Leibniz and Peter the Great. That was probably the first instance. Maybe Peter didn't even realize it. He stumbled upon this gold mine by accident. But he seized it. The point is, yes, intellectuals can be bought, even the most famous ones, like Voltaire. There's even a story. Lessing fell out with Voltaire when he realized Voltaire was ready to take money from anyone. But money isn't enough. You also have to match their idealized image. Enlightenment thinkers needed both a mirror and a utopia, an ideal to believe in. For Machiavelli earlier on, that was the Ottoman Empire, an ideal state by his standards. But for Enlightenment thinkers, it was Persia at first, Montesquieu's fictional version, and then Russia. For Voltaire, Russia was the West, as it should be. And so, over and over, this repeats. First, the Enlightenment thinkers build the idea of a Russian mirage, a supposedly ideal state that has no real-world equivalent. But it doesn't matter, as long as people believe in it. First, it's the Enlightenment thinkers, then the revolutionaries. Then, during the revolution, the bloody face of Catherine the Great's regime is revealed. The revolutionaries become disillusioned, and then the conservatives fall in love with Russia. They say, this is the untouched medieval Europe we've lost. Let's not touch it. Let's admire it. Then comes another twist, like with Marquis de Custine. He went to Russia imagining it was the perfect country for lovers of the old regime, the ideal monarchy. But what he found shocked him. He returned still a conservative, but saying, a person must be free. Where there is no freedom, there is nothing. And there is no freedom in Russia by definition.
Це зовсім не те, про що він повертається, не революціонером, він залишається консерватором, але повертається зі словами про те, що людина має бути вільною. Там, де немає свободи, нічого, а в Росії свободи немає, за визначенням.
He wrote a book. It was a hit. Russia's elite panicked. And that's when projects like Turgenev's were born. At first, they tried to commission Dumas to write a counterbook. Then Balzac. Ukrainians love to say Balzac spoke beautifully of Kyiv and Ukraine, but forget he wrote all that before he even visited. It was commissioned. He was a literary figure after all. So what I'm saying is, Russians know how to present themselves as something else, to get invited to the table.
Тому що в нього було замовлення написати гарно, він написав. Літератор все-таки. Тобто, я до чого це веду? Що
That's the first trick. The second is, they seduce intellectuals with a fantasy, with the image of this ideal country. Then the empire ends, and the USSR begins. Now Soviet Russia becomes the light in the window, a utopia of freedom and justice. Even now, some still believe it.
Радянський Союз, більшовицька Росія теж світло у віконці. Досі багато хто вірить, що це було країна свободи і справедливості, пролетарства.
Some, like Bernard Shaw or Romain Rolland, were guests, saw the facade and liked it. Others, who looked behind the curtain, like André Gide, saw the truth. When he came back from the Soviet Union, he said exactly what de Custine had said a century earlier about the empire. In Europe, we don't value our freedom. You must go to Russia to understand the value of freedom. Literally those words. This, as one 20th century philosopher put it, is the opium of the intellectuals. That's another key mistake.
Цінність свободи, яку ми в Європі не цінуємо. Тобто, буквально такі слова. Тобто, знову-таки, цей опій для інтелектуалів, як...
Ultimately, the biggest danger is simply letting the Russians sit at the table. Once they're at the table, half the battle is already lost.
Ті, хто намагається грати з Росії, те, що вони просто пускають росіян за стіл.
You know, we don't need to dive into centuries to find examples, literally, from the modern day. Hugh Grant, a famous British actor who is very popular in America and a global star, in London, comes for the screening of a film about Navalny. Invited, so to speak, by a good Russian, Maria Pevchikh, who is here manifesting as a big opposition figure with money from her father, who is in power in Kremlin, well, in local government, laundering money, so on. There are gossips, some people say. Second point, an absolutely goal-focused series about goals. Just like that. It was 20 years ago, Sex and the City, now just like that. Sarah Jessica Parker walks through New York holding Navalny's autobiography. Well, where from? Well, what? Well, how?
You know, once again, I'm the kind of person who, well, maybe it's my education or perhaps just my interest in history, but the whole story with the good Russians is nothing new. We've seen it before, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The entire Russian emigration was fighting Tsarism. Everyone was donating money, and again, it's hard to even criticize it. People were fighting Tsarism. These weren't today's people on a leash. There were revolutionaries. There were Ukrainians too, like Stepniak Kravchinsky, who even wrote in Ukrainian, and others. But again, Maxim Gorky comes, collects money for arming the Bolsheviks, the same Bolsheviks who then come to power. And again, how did this happen? It's unclear. When the Soviet Union collapses, especially after World War II, when the USSR was at the peak of its popularity, then comes the Cold War, and people start realizing that something is off with this utopia. 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and it begins to decline. Take Sartre, he was fully pro-Soviet. Camus, on the other hand, defended Pasternak and wrote, "You are a representative of that 19th century Russia we were raised on." Again, this romantic idea, the government is bad, but the people are good, and the culture is great, repeats over and over again, probably because people have this need to be enchanted. And then later they say, how foolish we were, how we were deceived, and yet they step on the same rake all over again. So what I'm saying is, that we Ukrainians are left with the hard job, and I'm afraid it won't be for just 10 years, but much, much longer, of telling the truth. Because it's easier to just grab Navalny's biography. You don't even have to read it, you know? It's not necessary. It's all about the image. Look, I'm reading Navalny's biography, or War and Peace, or Crime and Punishment. But Crime and Punishment, and Dostoevsky in general, that's a terrifying act of sabotage against European civilization. What's the essence of Dostoevsky that might attract intellectuals or seekers of meaning? That deviance is normal. You can murder and cry about it.
Таємнича російська душа.
You can kill and talk about the tear of a child, and that's somehow considered part of the great Russian soul. And you know, the whole Russian soul idea is kind of laughable, because the concept itself was basically born out of a translation mishap. In one of Dostoevsky's novels, there's a Russian proverb, something like, "Another person's soul is darkness, chuzhaya dusha, potemki," and English and German translators struggled to convey it. No matter how they translated it, it came out sounding like mysterious soul. Dostoevsky himself didn't even intend this meaning. The translators basically invented it. And that's how intellectuals built an image of Russia that has no connection to reality, but exists only in their heads. It's a perfect example of how translators created the myth of great Russian culture through their own interpretations, not the original texts. And again, from my point of view, it's very telling that Joseph Goebbels began his dissertation with a quote from Dostoevsky. He really admired him, because Dostoevsky's ideas completely aligned with the concept of undermining Western civilization from the inside.
У своїй книжці
In your book, you quite literally name the intellectuals who helped feed and nurture this monster. Let me list them. Prokopovich, our very own Leibniz, Fontenelle, Voltaire, Diderot, Goethe, Dumas, the editors of Morning Post in London, Paris Press, Rilke, Nietzsche, Bernard Shaw, John Steinbeck. Look, all these intellectuals contributed. And today, from my own experience, take the BBC, for example, there are different language services. The Ukrainians, yeah, they are pitied, but just somewhat. You know who gets the real sympathy? The staff of the Russian service, because they are seen as more cultured, more refined, even more dangerous. It's not just them, but what they actually write in their stories. Like in Bucha, they would write, toilets were carried from the neighboring houses. That's how they explain the looting. Or the missiles just fell from the sky. Just fell, as if no one launched them. Just, in Kiev Oblast, we apparently have a natural phenomena. Missiles just randomly fall from the sky. No one drops them, no one fires them, they just fall. And people, when under occupation, apparently they flee with toilets in tow. But the most frightening thing I've been dealing with since 2014 is the Russophiles. These are the people who in their student years studied Russian, Anglo-Saxon, Brits, I mean. Some of them went to Moscow, some didn't, depends on their personal history, but there's this lingering attitude, this intellectual aura, this flair. Like, studying Russian gives you a touch of sophistication. Even among those who now strongly support Ukraine, if they once studied Russian, there is still this undertone, this nostalgia. It gives them kind of elitist glow. And now these people, some of them, head of some language services, work high up in it, and on the surface they seem like reasonable people. I mean, they're British after all, but in reality they promote narratives like there are good Russians. Not everything is so black and white. What can Ukraine do to fight this? Because these people, they are like wolves in sheep's clothing.
По-перше, українцям треба ще навести в себе лад, бо в нас така ж сама проблема.
Well, first of all, Ukrainians need to put their own house in order. We have the same problem ourselves.
Куди там Ільф і Петров, все інше, розумієте? І при тому, що, знаєте, ну, я навіть порівняв це...
We also have that romanticism, the crunch of French bread rolls, so to speak. Where do we even place Bulgakov or Ilf and Petrov? You see, we've inherited all that too.
Розумні люди ніби цим не сильно пишаються, да? Тут зрозуміло, що де зло, де добро. А тут якось це
And yes, you could argue that, say, Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, also carries nostalgia for the American South, but at least sensible people today don't exactly take pride in that.
Це перше. Тобто українцям треба навести лад.
The lines between good and evil are clear there. With Russian culture, everything is mixed up. Someone can be clearly on the side of evil, yet we still say, well, that's how we were raised. Well, yes, we were raised poorly, so to speak. That's the core of it. So yes, there is a Russian culture. Fine, let the Russians deal with it. Why are we dragging it over here? Take the media space, for example. Most of our early YouTube experts were Russian-speaking, often from Russia. Didn't matter who they were, just the fact that they were from Moscow gave them some automatic authority. It was the same in the 90s with political technologists. You could be from some random nowhere town, but if you were from Russia, you were treated differently, like a foreigner of a higher class. And then there's Europe, and we can't ignore it. Europe has been under cultural poisoning since the 19th century. The only antidote is detox, slow, persistent work. We have to talk about it constantly, remind people, not get lazy, use every opportunity. Because this cultural residue lives inside us too, even in the nostalgia, like the old line, to live in that beautiful time won't be granted to me or to you. A very Russian sentiment, beautifully written, sure, but soaked in regret. In that sense, I'm still an optimist. All historians are, because if we've survived, then that's already something. But I'm not so optimistic as to think this can be solved within a single generation. Clearly, it will take not one, not two, but many generations. And the work needs to begin now. If we start later, the result will come later, and our chances of success decrease. Every lost year means double the work in the future. So we must start now. No laziness. And again, Russians are always complaining about cancel culture. But as one character in a Soviet comedy once said, nice boots, gotta take 'em. If they're whining, it means it hurts. Which means it's working. Ukrainians need to set the tone, a sort of cultural hygiene. We're not banning Russian culture, just saying, take it somewhere else. If you want to study it, fine, but not with our involvement, and ideally in isolated, sealed-off spaces, so you don't infect anyone else. Because yes, Slavic studies in the West often just means Russian studies. And here's the thing. Anyone who studies a subject tends to fall a little in love with it. Doesn't matter if it's Russian culture, bacteria, or medieval coins. The human mind adapts and starts assigning value, intelligence, even personality to what it studies. I'm not saying people are bacteria. I'm saying all researchers experience a kind of Stockholm syndrome. And Russia has weaponized that. They've poured money into it since Peter the Great, who, by the way, underpaid Leibniz, but at least got the idea. Starting with Catherine the Great, they never skimped on intellectual bribes. They've bought off politicians, sure, but especially intellectuals. So yes, some people still love Tolstoy. Others read Dostoevsky. Some carry Navalny's biography like a sacred object. Well, every time, we need to say, that's not okay. I mean, no one carries around a biography of Hitler, right? It's just not done. Same with others like him. There are some things you just don't do, like washing your hands before eating. It's basic hygiene. Ukrainians must set this tone. Yes, we'll be annoying. Yes, people will say, oh, you Ukrainians are so biased. But there's no other way, because we are up against people who were already biased, long before we even began to speak.
Look, your colleague Timothy Snyder.
Thank you, by the way. That's a compliment.
Well, historians, right? One of his most well-known and I would say most widely quoted ideas is his "all empires have fallen and it was always for the better." He gives example of European empires and say, now it's time for the Russian Empire to fall as well, to let go of all these archaic ideas and finally become something good.
Well, first of all, I think Timothy Snyder is a bit too optimistic. Nostalgia for empires hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, it's clearly gaining momentum lately. Just look at Trump. His role models, Andrew Jackson, who he actually resembles in some ways, and Theodore Roosevelt, although he doesn't quite measure up to him, in my view. But still, it says something. After all, Roosevelt was the one who essentially began shaping the American empire. And around us, our neighbors too. One walks around with a scarf depicting Greater Hungary. Another complains that all the Poles have offended him. This kind of imperial nostalgia, it's a trend. And to be fair, we Ukrainians aren't entirely immune either. Sure, we didn't have an empire, although honestly, I was once struck by how my Macedonian acquaintances looked at a historical atlas showing the campaigns of Alexander the Great. You should have seen their eyes. That same spark exists even in Ukrainians when they look at a map of Kievan Rus. So maybe it's something in human nature. The larger the past, the more impressive it feels. And if even Ukraine, which never had an empire, feels that tug, what can we say about nations that actually were empires? I think the British and the French still remain, to a great extent, imperial nations. The only difference is, it's no longer fashionable to brag about it. Like in that old Ukrainian parable, which I don't really love, but it fits here. And the wise old man said, that's nothing to be proud of. That's about where we are. Of course, I wish Snyder were right and I were wrong. But it seems to me that he's a bit overly optimistic. And secondly, who exactly got better off after the fall of an empire? Some regular people in the colonies or periphery maybe, but for those who built the empires, of course they mourn the loss. And those who wish they could take their place, they mourn too. We see this clearly in Putin. I doubt he's going to celebrate the disintegration of the Russian Federation, let's be honest. So when Snyder talks about letting go, we should ask, who is he talking to? Especially considering the oft-repeated idea that Russia has a civil society, which is, let's say, highly exaggerated. Frankly, it's an exaggeration even when applied to Ukraine, and for Russia, it's just not true at all. So again, it feels like wishful thinking, and it's unlikely that Snyder is going to persuade Putin, especially when Snyder himself has admitted that historians are powerless in the face of a dictator's fantasies, because those fantasies have nothing to do with actual history. And yes, the word powerless, he used it.
By the way, speaking of maps and the collapse of empires, I'm talking about that map, the one in the head of Ukraine's defense intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, the map where Russia has broken apart. Of course, it's gotten a lot of attention. So here's my question. How do you personally see this? More as a historian, kind of hopeful, optimistic one, or more as a powerful tool of communication strategy? Because after all, you're also a political technologies expert.
Of course, in Budanov's case, this is a communication tactic. And the people in Ukraine who are seriously discussing the potential collapse of the Russian Empire, well, to some extent, they're engaged in a form of collective therapy, right? Naturally, no one can predict these processes with certainty. History, as we know, doesn't operate in the conditional tense. But just in case, the more we talk about it, the better, I suppose. Now, when it comes to optimism versus pessimism, I do agree with Snyder on one point. Empires, at the very least, tend to fall apart. And I don't think the Russian Empire will be an exception. It will collapse, in my view, simply because, well, it's not a homogeneous entity. No matter how much its creators, and now its rulers, might wish it were. Right now, they're trying to bind it together, including through the war against Ukraine. They're turning regional elites into accomplices, making them complicit in the war effort. These elites receive certain benefits. They mobilize their own populations. And in doing so, the Kremlin tries to tie them more tightly to the imperial structure. But history, including Russian history, shows that sometimes there's a breaking point when a system starts to fall apart, and it usually cracks along fault lines that were there from the start. Russia, in that sense, is one massive fault line. So sooner or later, I believe this collapse will happen. But, and this is key, building your national strategy on the assumption that Russia is about to collapse. That's, at best, a kind of historical arrogance. Let it be a pleasant surprise if and when it happens. But don't bet the strategy on it. Strategy has to be built on what we can control, or at least aspire to control. That means our own resources and our relationships with potential partners. I'd love to call them allies, but frankly, lately they behave more like partners. That's the reality, and that's where Ukraine can take ownership and act. Unlike the internal dynamics of Russia, which we can't control, we might be able to push here and there, especially with precision strikes on military infrastructure, which of course is important and should continue. The more, the better. But to assume that Russia will fall apart only because of these strikes, I wouldn't go that far.
Well, yes, the moral state of Russia is definitely being hit. Look, I have not been living in Ukraine for some time. I can still absolutely feel it that, for example, back in 2014, the country was losing the information war on all fronts, really. As an example, I was part of the team making documentary about the invasion, about the annexation of Crimea. Anyway, I'll tell you this, the editor, the chief editor of the program, we were working on the BBC here in London, he was perfectly reasonable, normal person. He didn't seem like Russophile or anything. But still, there was absolutely typical situation. Something happened in Ukraine. I would read it about on Ukrainska Pravda. And I tell him such and such has happened. And instead of just acknowledging the truth, he would say, oh, let's check. Then he would go to Russia Today website to see if it's true, to see what the professionals are saying. You see, there was 2014. By 2022, in this war, Russia completely lost that information battle. The atmosphere in the newsroom, even at the BBC, completely changed. And just a couple of weeks after the invasion, I started working for the BBC's main competitor, ITV, and the atmosphere there was entirely different. In this new information campaign, Ukraine was winning, and in my view, it continues to win. At least that's the impression that we all hope it's true. This time, Ukraine finally appeared on the map of the world in this big global media landscape. It's no longer some vague, far-off part of Russia. It's a place in its own right. And today we've been talking about all these myths that Russia has spent so much time and money building, and how generations of people in different countries have become victims of them. So, my question is, what historical myths about Ukraine would you like to see dispelled or controversially created in the context of this struggle, this fight Ukraine is waging for its independence and identity?
Well, first and foremost, the myth that Ukraine and Russia have anything in common at all must be definitively destroyed. This myth is still very much alive. It hasn't gone anywhere. Yes, of course, many things have changed, but there's still this. But you're still brotherly nations, right? You're both Orthodox after all, aren't you? You were together in the Soviet Union. You know, that's like saying, well, Britain was in an alliance with Stalin, so that's basically the same thing. See, this myth, which still hasn't been fully dismantled, needs to be destroyed. And to do that, people need access to real information. Sometimes you have to deliver it forcefully, if you will, about Ukraine's independent development, about Ukraine as a distinct entity. There is a history of Russia, and there is a history of Ukraine. These are not the same history. They are parallel and often opposing trajectories. Very few people know this, especially in the West. Even with all our historical tensions with the Poles, I'd say the Poles are much closer to understanding this, because it's part of their own history too. They were once also forced to be part of the Russian story. Now, on the Western Front, yes, we've achieved a lot. Ukraine has, in some ways, finally appeared on the world map. But for example, Crimea still hasn't. People still look at Crimea and say, well, let's check the Russian sources to verify the information. The history of Crimea as a separate story. That isn't being told. The history of the Crimean Tatars. It's barely known. Maybe in Turkey. Outside Turkey, no one knows it at all, but it's very important. For instance, right now we're working on a major project. It's loosely affiliated with Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty. They have a new platform called Priazovia, and within it, we have a project called Deoccupied History, focused on the south of Ukraine, on the history of southern Ukraine, which was distorted and censored during the Russian Empire. Even for me, someone who's interested in this, even though I never wrote a book about it, I'm discovering new things, new nuances, and the majority of Ukrainians, let alone people in the West. What's that?
Sorry, I'm looking for a book. It's about Crimea, written by the Cambridge professor Rory Finnin.
I don't know. But you know, the British still have, let's say, a certain nostalgia for the Victorian era and the Crimean War, and somehow that puts the word Crimea on their mental map. But again, I have a book, mine, dedicated specifically to southern Ukraine, and it's actually called The Unfinished Crimean War, because it's a paradox. Russia lost the Crimean War, but it won the peace. The peace treaty was concluded under such conditions that, I don't know who, basically the victorious Ottoman Empire, was subjected to almost the same restrictions as Russia. You see why? Because the peoples subdued by Russia, and generally the peoples of the East from the Russian point of view. Even back in the time of the Crimean War, no one even raised the question, why not restore Crimea's independence, which it lost just about 70 years before the Crimean War? It would have been a logical question, but no one thought about it. When the French found a descendant of the Jere, the English just shook their heads and said, "What are you making up?" This story wasn't agreed with us. So to some extent, this is still a legacy of the imperial past in Britain and France. That kind of attitude, because psychologically they still perceived Russians as on their side. That is, they were like us. This is exactly the paradigm that Russia constantly exploits, you see. If you do something, then we can do it too. If you have an empire, then we must have an empire as well. If Western Europe is in the sphere of influence of the United States, then Eastern Europe must be in Moscow's sphere of influence. Why should it be so? Who said that? But again, the fact that we lost the war in 2014 was largely because Russia managed to impose this comparison between European metropolises and themselves. At least regarding Crimea, Russia said, "Crimea is our territory. You had your territories, and we have ours. We conquered Crimea," and so on. But in 2022, everything flipped. By the way, you mentioned the traps for those caught in Russia's traps, but it's a trap for Russia itself. Russia always loses because of its own arrogance and excessive desires. Their greed always betrays them. And of course, the underestimation of their opponent, like with Ukraine in 2022. These are the vulnerabilities of Russia. In 2022, they just got so brazen, probably because in 2014, they imposed their narratives that they decided they could do anything. Even those who treat Ukrainians without the kind of respect we would like still decided, from a moral standpoint, that it was right to side with the victim, because Ukraine was the victim. Now they are beginning to shift a bit. We see this again with the Poles, meaning that Ukrainians are not quite the ones we wanted them to be, you see? But then, of course, even Duda quite openly said in an interview that the neighbor is being killed. So how can I demand anything from him? But that doesn't mean anyone has abandoned their demands. They are just postponed for the future. So we will still have problems with many of our current partners. But again, that's life. We will work on it.
Are you looking at the new president of Poland from a pessimistic point of view, despite the fact that he...
I am a big optimist. Again, I say historians are big optimists because they believe that, well, they know things could have been worse. Of course, someone like Manson could have become president. But again, that doesn't mean he won't end up in a governing coalition tomorrow in case of re-elections or whatever else. So I just don't want to get carried away with illusions. You say these were just election promises. Well, with Trump it was the same. It was just election promises. And now look how he behaves. I think everyone's laughing, even how he tries to play to Putin himself. He even says, "It would be worse if only I helped you, Uncle Volodya." So again, I don't want to be an overly optimistic person because, you know, there's this saying, actually a Soviet joke, who is a pessimist? A well-informed optimist. And who is an optimist? A well-instructed pessimist. So I don't want to be an instructed optimist, an optimist by instruction. I think we need to accept reality as it is. There's nothing good to expect from the new president of Poland for Ukraine. I'd like to be wrong. Let that be a pleasant surprise for us. But right now, at least at this moment, I don't see any grounds for such joy.
Look, today we're talking a lot about this myth making, but surely you know, in order to really understand Ukraine, to perceive it, to grasp, maybe Ukraine needs to enter through myths into the Western cultural space. What do you consider?
Well, look, even if I have a book about myths, though not Ukrainian myths, I mean, nevertheless, any history, especially national history, didactic history, the kind that is popularized and taught in schools and universities, is definitely a myth. It is connected to scientific history, but not identical to it, so to speak. Certainly, these are myths. Myths need to be worked with, not invented, but rather they are a result of the self-awareness of a people or nation through intellectuals, of course. So they need to be worked on, I would say, and particularly important for Ukraine, as I mentioned about the stereotype that Ukraine shares some common history with Russia. It is very important to constantly remind our friends, and not only friends but also influence others through friends, that Ukrainian history is part of European history and world history. This is also very important to constantly remind, mention and, by the way, for Ukrainians themselves to know, because Ukrainians also tend to, as I already said, have a kind of nationalist tendency. And now it is strengthening for understandable reasons. Ukrainians are fighting a war for survival, which is a specific psychological and emotional state. Nevertheless, Ukrainians very often simply do not understand that Ukraine has existed in the context of European and world history. Even many misunderstandings with our neighbors are largely from the Ukrainian side, although there are problems on the neighbors' side as well. But if we talk about working on ourselves, so to speak, from the Ukrainian side, it can be explained by the fact that Ukrainians do not fully understand this context. Ukraine is actually part of Europe, part of the world, much more connected with Europe and the world than with our northeastern neighbor, let's call it that. We also have connections with the steppe world that are much deeper than they seem at first glance, but that's, let's say, a completely separate story.
The question I ask all my guests: what do you love about Ukraine?
I don't love Ukraine, you know. I believe that Ukrainians don't love their country because sometimes they do things to it that you simply wouldn't do to something you love. That's why I don't love Ukrainians or Ukraine, because you have to nurture your history and your country. And I would really want that to happen, and to happen more and more. It's not enough for me, as someone interested in history, to see how Ukrainians know and understand their own history.
But you do love it, right?
Of course, this is my country. I consider myself a part of it, inseparable, so to speak. I really want Ukraine to develop, flourish, bloom, and grow stronger in every way, economically, culturally, and in every aspect. It's simply a wonderful country, and I believe there's no other country like it in the world. But that's why I want Ukrainians themselves to treat this treasure with more respect.
Thank you for finding time to talk to me today.
There was Oleksii Mustafin about history, the creature, the monster created West, Ukraine, and many, many, many useful idiots, intellectuals through the centuries. Let me know what you think about Trumps through the history, their mistakes, and the myths about Ukraine, or the ugly truth about Ukraine you learned. And so let's discuss it in the comments. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you disagree with. And thank you for spending this time with us, watching. And if you liked, please thumbs up, share, subscribe if you haven't. And I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. I'm Jenny Klochko.